Hello, my name is Peter Krapp and I'm currently the Department Chair for Film and Media Studies. In media studies, we're interested in exploring the history and the conceptual underpinnings of how media technologies allow meaning to arise. So for instance, if you look at the history of media technology, the control and input devices can tell us an interesting story. When, for instance, in computer and game setups, we want to describe how technical and other protocols structure your interaction. We can focus on control, but we need to go and look beyond the input device as such, and beyond the history and the affordances of controllers to get at the story of control. Because the control means at least three different things. It means that you look over something, you surveil something or someone, suggesting a means of domination or power. It also means exercising restraint, regulating, curbing the spread of something. That's also control. So as the etymology of that word control suggests, there's also a managerial activity. You control, check, manage, test, verify certain processes in interacting with people or with machines or with people through machines. In all three of those registers, sort of a very hands-on manipulation, a selection process, and this managerial oversight, you can see that they're pivotal for our setup in computing and, for my favorite example of computing in computer gaming. But to the extent that games are sort of an adaptive response to the omnipresence of computing, you notice that almost every gadget that you acquire comes with a game pre-installed so that you learn to use the buttons and interact with the interface. The affordances and strictures of devices control what we see as possible with our devices. Put another way, a closer look at the gaming controls or computing controls needs to go beyond the twitchy feedback of input devices and include a sense of the media historical and technical conditions of possibility of the setup that we're so familiar with today. This is not to say that the actual control input devices are not an important aspect of debugging this sense of media history. Whether one sees the graphic user interface, the GUI that we're all living with now, as a Taylorist discipline that teaches us ergonomic interaction, or as yielding to reductions of interaction to resemble what users had already learned, you just do what you're habituated to. The graphic user interface is pivotal to our culture. You see it in ATMs, you see it on computers, you see it in cars. And the discursive formation of that is an interesting chapter of media history. What's critical here is that interaction revolves around perception, hand-eye coordination, and discerning errors. Input devices and operating routines must be controlled or they appear faulty. If my clicking or pecking can yield unpredictable results to create the correct or erroneous impression of variable and perhaps uncontrollable situations, then a fundamental principle of interaction is at stake, a peculiar blasphemy against a very widely held principle, the belief about designing human-computer interaction. Observers of computing culture have even joked that if an interface designer were to design a game, they would just put a big red button there that says press here to win, because then you can't get it wrong. Inversely, though, if my user interface is complex and allows for all sorts of complicated interactions, they can become chaotic and irregular, whether in a browser window or in a game. It could be a buggy beta, or it could be an artsy deconstruction of the browser or the game. Then I'm very highly unlikely to accord any value to accidental elements. So the typical graphic user interface, from the desktop metaphors of Vinnie Verbush's Memex to the Xerox Star or Apple Lisa or other very influential personal computers to today, and our mobile devices, they all aim for visibility and patient acceptance or even anticipation of user error. However, the games are a special case where They probe the twitchy limits of reaction times, and they punish a user error with loss of symbolic energy. Audiovisual cues in both cases pull users into feedback loops that a game might exhibit proudly, while other less playful user interfaces like your Microsoft Word or your web browser will tend to hide them in some redundant metaphors. Very few people can claim to have played the original Tennis for Two from 1958, or the original Space War levers from 1961, or the knobs of the Coleco Telstar or the Wander Wizard. Maybe some people recall the Odyssey shooting gallery rifle, or the NES Zapper pistol, or the Sega Light Phaser, or the Atari and Sega Saturn pistols, etc., etc. So there are controllers in game history that kind of jumpstart the idea that you should be able to do something with the world behind the screen. There's the NES Power Glove, there's the Sony iToy more recently, there's the Kinect interface, and they kind of rehabilitate the idea that it doesn't have to just be windows, icons, pointer, kind of simple interface. Music and rhythm games in particular, of course, expand the vocabulary of interaction. But of course, even if there are instruments, guns, racing wheels, trackballs, for the most part, control devices that offer alternatives to the generic keyboard have congealed around a joystick and button design. Many gamers, and of course most computer users, still are restricted to the QWERTY keyboard as their main input device. There are some console-style input devices that you can use with computers, and you can use tablets to draw and so on, but for the most part, we inherit a 19th century format to use a 21st century machine. So that means that beyond the consolations of timelines and industry histories, debugging this history of control on the computer requires us to outline some conceptual dimensions that underpin this interface culture, the media history from the 19th century to today. We can recognize what I would call three clusters of technology and of rhetoric and of a psychological register in what gaming in particular and computing in general sort of weave into their setup. And different cases will foreground different aspects of these three. There are certainly differences between controlling a video game race car, controlling an avatar in a role-play mode, and controlling the tax rate in a simulation game. Right? So those are the three registers of control that I touched on at the beginning. And action-type games rely most obviously on speedy reactions at the graphic user interface that provides immersive metaphors. Right? Psychologically, they tend to emphasize thrills or transgressions, speed, etc. Flying and other things that I can't do without that setup. Adventure and role-play games, meanwhile, they don't rely on speed. They're not so reliant on graphics. They rely on decisions and explorations, emphasizing not so much the graphics as the database and pivoting less on the metaphor of an immersive screen as on metonymy, substitution rhetorically. Not this, but that. Not this way, but that path. Strategy games in the third cluster, they foreground planning and constellation. They emphasize rules. They emphasize consequences in a logic that's more sort of rhetorically like an allegory, something that proliferates across the game, fostering not so much the rush of the id or the role play of the ego, but the rule-based play of the superego, we might say in a psychological register. So control in games that emphasize graphics, immersion, and speed will hinge on the input device, but control in role play will center on interaction, design, and choice, while control in strategy games or God games and simulation games will lean much more towards an overview and a planning perspective. What all three registers share, however, is that they have deep roots in media technology and tradition that go back to long before the history of computers. Modern information technologies really take shape more than a century ago in certain ways. What in the mechanical era was affected by a crank or a lever becomes a mere trigger in the computer era. The desired effect is already stored in the apparatus. It's hidden in its complication to suggest effortless use. You just press the close the door button in the elevator which may or may not be a placebo, and you trust that the machine is translating that into action. So if we trace the interface design history of computing back to the formation of these three associative clusters in terms of technology, rhetoric, and psychology, and we see that the interface that we know today owes a lot to Frank Bunker Gilbreth and his pioneering applied motion studies, where he sought to transform the conditions of labor into the foundations of scientific management at the beginning of the 20th century. Parallel to Taylor, but in a much more sophisticated way, Frank Gilbreth and his wife Lillian Gilbreth, who was an early graduate of Berkeley with a PhD in psychology, hired themselves out to factories and trained record typists and studied with chronocyclography, with slow motion film, using film technology in the earliest days, how an effective, efficient motion can avoid repetition, can avoid strain, can be effective. So that's certainly one of the principles that we draw on for our graphics and our graphic interface. The database, meanwhile, of course, has its roots in the long history of library catalogs, of business card catalogs, and strategy games have a documented long history in mete and planning scenarios, where the maps and calculation tables are now black boxed into complex scenarios of software, of planning, but also of strategy games, and the decision trees and associative links that go into databases of items, paths, characters for role-play games are, of course, also rarely encountered in isolation. They all have to have some kind of graphic representation. And often our assumption of how natural screens are glosses over the media history of their roots in the radar screens of Second World War. So if having simple controls at the tips of your finger dissolves the close relation between cause and effect, it can also remove the finger from responsibility in direct correlation to the obscuring of the informational process. The more our user interfaces trivialize information technology and relegate us to just mere button pushers, the more digital cultures threatens to resemble the seductive yet very dysfunctional placebo of the close the button in elevators. Computers are complex enough that we've come to accept that their inner workings are hidden behind interfaces that make them usable. This usability technical provision sets the scene for feedback loops of input devices, screen events, and the player's conditioning to repeat or progress. The media history can help us understand this better, understand both the conditions of possibility and the consequences of this user interface culture. Following the iterative conditioning of the user by windows, icons, menus, and pointers, metaphors, we need to interrogate the surfaces and other control metaphors of the graphic user interface. Here, a second film history document is Doug Engelbart's Mother of All Demos, a demonstration of what Doug Engelbart in 1968 thought computers of the future could do. So we've gone from the early 20th century to about the halfway mark between Gilbreth and today. In a demonstration at the Fall Joint Computer Conference in San Francisco on Monday afternoon in December 1968, his presentation was followed by access to remote terminals to the SRI computers in Menlo Park, about 30 miles away, in, quote, a special room set aside for the purpose. Now, this is before the birth of the internet. It became enshrined as a mother of all demos, and you can still find it on YouTube relatively easily because it very influentially showcased graphics in Windows, navigation and voice input, video conferencing, the computer mouse, word processing, and online collaboration, all before any of these became a reality. Once it became evident that this model was going to take over almost completely in the 90s, some experts started deploring the lack of innovation in interfaces between Engelbart in the late 60s and the late 90s, and started calling for a computer-human interface that is much more based on language, that has richer representation of objects, that allows expert users to do more sophisticated things, and that shares control. But we're still stuck with 19th century keyboards, with early 20th century ideas about the screen surface, and with these sort of 60s office culture-based metaphors, despite all attempts to break out of that logic. So studying media history of that sort means not just to look at the technical history, but also to look at, you know, the influence that certain models, certain metaphors, certain rhetoric, certain psychological setups have on the user and on the idea of usability. And so we can call for increased literacy about command and control structures that, like learning to swim or learning to read, enable us to move past fear and isolation into an active engagement with computer culture as, in the early days, as something completely unknown and maybe even incalculable. This would allow us to move away from the infantilizing attraction of playing with technology, playing with machines, as obedient to certain rules, and it would show us the lessons of what really control means. In a secondary mode, we could build up on the discovery and exploration of regularities or irregularities of the interface and invite some kind of creative interaction, some kind of playful interaction. So in game studies, obviously, the difference between playing a game and playing with the game is crucial. Well, the former teaches you the rules of the game through navigating the game's commands and controls, the rules of the machine, the rules of the setup. The latter can open up to critical and self-aware exploration and maybe to innovation. So just like learning to swim, learning to use a computer means learning to learn and initiates us into training systems. But just like learning to read, it doesn't stop at literal obedience to the setup. It doesn't mean that you have to obey the command and control setup. Certainly computer games tend to obey a certain set of design rules, chief among them efficiency, expediency, mastery of interfaces and interaction, since we value in our computer setup that it works. But there is also a hidden potential to explore in terms of play. So this technologic that's embedded in control devices can also be said to install a program in the user. That means the more you withdraw access to the hardware and the software behind ever more superficial, intuitive interfaces, the touch screen of your iPad, for instance, the less actual control you have as a user, despite and because of the illusion of being in control of your device. Examples include, you know, the Wii that can never actually be turned off, or the Xbox 360 that won't accept older Xbox devices, the mobile phone that reports on your location and on your consumption of information to the publishers and developers of any software that's on it, including not just the cell phone provider, but also the provider of the hardware and providers of apps that you have on it. So there's control that also has a social dimension. As Deleuze pointed out with reference to Foucault, there's a historical shift from sovereignty to discipline, and then on from there to what he calls a society of control, where he sees power located in an increasingly decentralized way. It's no longer embodied, not built into social structures, but it's anonymously and autonomously regulating and manipulating the flow of all social exchanges. So in a medieval order of sovereign power, rulers taxed and disciplined societies. They threatened rather than organized. In Foucault's conception of the disciplinary societies that arose later, individuals used to pass from the family to school, to training barracks, to factories, from one institutionalized space to another, including, of course, the hospital and the prison, potentially. But in turn, after World War II, environments of enclosure and interiority entered into crisis mode, were marked by endless waves of reform. You know, think of school reform, military reform, prison reform, healthcare reform, and so forth, while there are new free-floating forces of control: pharmaceutical production, genetic manipulation, information processing, and as the corporation replaces the factory, continuous education replaces school, ankle bracelets replace the prison, perpetual control replaces the rites of passage that used to separate the various spaces of enclosure. So according to Deleuze, control is not discipline, In making freeways, for example, you don't enclose people, but you multiply means of control. Think of, since I'm talking about computer games here part of the time, think of the phenomenon known as gamification, whereby the masses are being enticed into quasi-playful digital labor that is often little more than a new kind of crowd control with an ever more invisible hand. Along the same lines, multiplayer games see a lot of crowd control, channeling what is not possible in games by dint of constraints that are less technical than they are political and economical. So to conclude, a cursory account of control in the computer age, with gaming as a particular example, can profile three strands that each bring their own historical depth to bear in media studies. One is the heritage of ergonomics and usability testing, going back to Gilbreth, going back to early film, where the image source is the reality of the workplace. The tasks are mechanical in a setup that regulates energy, avoiding fatigue. The motivation is physical production, and the peculiarity of the interface is that the reality is treated as a surface. It becomes a screen surface. Control, in that sense, is the reduction of complexity and of fatigue, harnesses repetition. In the Windows icons, menu, pointers era, the WIMP era from the 60s on, the image source is not reality, but a flattened representation. The tasks are more textual in a setup that regulates information. The motivation is mental production, not physical production. And the image is very symbolic screen action. Control, in that sense, is choice. It's sort of testing options. And finally, in the current register, in the 21st century, the image source is a stale metaphor where you pretend this pixel is a monster, or you pretend this button is controlling the elevator. This tree means forest, this tank means army, etc. You have metonymy. The task is selection and a setup regulating errors. The motivation is consumption, and the image simulates a surface. Control, in that sense, is regulating scenarios. It's the management sense. So under these progressively flattened circumstances, access to and interaction with interfaces makes human control only one facet of a very tightly constrained or really controlled environment that sometimes threatens to reduce the human in the loop from a true controller to a mere error between keyboard and chair. Thank you.